Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 313, my concept of incorruptible saints, incorruptible mummies of Buddhist monks, things of that nature, because it's something that seems to be reasonably common in some religions in the world. Catholicism, I think, is the big one in the West, Buddhism in the East. Although there are elements of this elsewhere, the concept of a corpse or something else that's generally supposed to rot or rust or decompose, not doing so, is typically held to be miraculous in a religious context, assuming that that object or corpse or whatever had a religious connotation. So some great hero, some priest, a monk, a saint or so forth. Here's the truth, though. The truth is that the concept of incorruptibility, as applied to especially corpses, is one that is laughable. The concept that a flaky, dusty, withered up mummy is not corruptible simply because it retains a roughly humanoid form. If you believe that, then you should adopt the ancient Egyptian religion, because through their mummification process, they were able to achieve this very easily. It was not difficult. With basic herbs and compounds, they were capable of preserving at least the outward form of the body. I mean, the organs would be, eventually they turned to dust and stuff. They pickled them separately in jars, usually. The nose may collapse. The insides may be eaten away at over time by corruption, but the external part of the body over the bones, it became almost incorruptible, to the point where Europeans were digging out mummies for 100 years there, and in the Victorian era they had mummy powder. It was considered a potent medicine. Whatever restorative materials were in whatever they were putting in these mummies, it must be medicinal. It kept them looking young. This dude's 5,000 years old. He doesn't look a day over 500. So it's good medicine. Of course, it's full of toxic compounds that thankfully over time tended to wear off. Most of it was herbal, which is the interesting part. The Buddhist monks in certain traditions, they do the same thing. They have a certain practice where they'll go and they'll literally let themselves die. They'll enter a deep meditative trance in certain caves. I can't remember the exact location. I do believe this is a specifically Tibetan practice, if I remember correctly. And they will go and they drink a poisoned tea that slowly infiltrates their body, and essentially it mummifies them while they're still alive. I can't remember the exact herbal compound that they use. But this is a form of mummification. The idea that this creates an incorruptible body is clearly wrong. You can still destroy the mummy. If left out in the elements, if it wasn't in a nice dry cave and got rained on multiple times, it would fall apart. The same is true of the Catholic saints that are supposedly incorruptible. People back in the early days, in 500-600 AD or something, they didn't really understand generally the decomposition process. It was considered sacrilegious, blasphemous, and was punishable in many cases by death to disinter the dead or to do anything to a body other than bury it, or in some cases cremate it. It was improper. Later on, they started making it aside for criminals. By then, of course, certain antiquated groups already had a full understanding of anatomy. Those works were typically also considered heretical. So if you were interested in medicine or healing or studying incorruptible saints, which you wouldn't have been able to even get near them, you would have had your head chopped off for heresy. If you wanted to do that, you had very, very little information to go on. Very long into the boom of Western civilization, people are still using Homeric theory. They didn't understand fully the concept of the corruption of dead bodies. Even in the Victorian era, we're talking not that long ago, we're talking your great-great-grandparents' era. Even then, bodily decomposition was so poorly misunderstood that people often thought real vampires existed. There was a vampire scare among the relatively intelligent, relatively literate populations of New England in the 19th century. There are steam trains and all of these other things, and starting to get metal-hulled ships, and people are worried about vampires because of tuberculosis. Because they would disinter, but they thought that there was vampirism because they would find the signs on the person, blood, of course, dripping. They'd find a disturbed grave or something. Oftentimes they would put them in the sides of cliffs, behind a wooden door actually, because they couldn't bury them during the winter because the ground is cold. And so they would put the body in basically what's a giant stone chill box in the middle of winter when a lot of bugs and stuff aren't really a thing. The flies aren't exactly coming in for the carrion, especially when the meat has been essentially near frozen. They would go in, people start dying of tuberculosis, often relatives, people that are related to each other. Some of that has to do with group malnutrition as opposed to actual contagion. Of course, a person that's well-fed, has a warm bed and stuff, typically is not going to even show signs of it if they get tuberculosis. And so the patterning of it led them to believe, because they didn't have an understanding of germs, they thought, hey, it's spreading from person to person. It's vampirism. This is due to contact vampirism. They'd go into the chill box, into the mausoleum, open it up and say, well, shit, there's this coffin's been disturbed, but nobody's been in here, and this body looks relatively fresh. Well, yes, you've refrigerated the body. In some cases, it was interred, but in certain spots, the ground was filled with certain alkaline chemicals that would preserve the body. They've dug up corpses from hundreds of years before and found fatty remnants there, because fat, of course, doesn't get eaten away by bacteria very easily. The corpse fat would still be there, and they're like, well, this body's bloated still. There's blood trickling down its mouth, which is the result of decomposition if it's early. It's the result of staining later on. Its fingernails have grown. Its hair has grown, both of which don't actually happen. It's the result of the shrinkage of the tissues away from the hair and nails. This person's a vampire. This body has become incorruptible. Now, of course, you take that body, put it out on a nice warm day, and let it get rained on a couple times, and within 48, 72 hours, it's gone. The maggots will have eaten it away. So much for the incorruptibility. If you therefore take the body of a saint, or certainly the body of a monk that has literally mummified themselves over the course of several months with poison and turned their own skin to leather, if you were to take these bodies and instead of reverently having them in a cave or a glass casket or very, very carefully preserved in the floorboards of a church, and you were to expose them to the elements, you would quickly see that they're not incorruptible. But because of people's faith in their incorruptibility, the usefulness of that miracle for the religion, and the vehemence with which people would probably burn you at the stake if you ever dared to desecrate these corpses, they will be always considered incorruptible until it is proven that they're not by natural decomposition processes. The commies are interested in this concept. Stalin and Lenin and some of these others are still preserved. They're rotting away. Apparently communists are worse at science than the ancient Egyptians. They didn't quite get the recipe right, and mushrooms keep growing on Joseph Stalin's cock. So I find that infinitely funny. And of course, if you were to handle these bodies without absolute care, they'd fall apart, because it's basically just a husk. It's like if I look at a bug, a dead bug. That bug may not decompose. If they're not predated upon, the innards of the body are gone, but all the chitin remains. The husk of the dead body, 100 years later, might still look like a bug under the proper conditions. But if it's left out to weather, it will decompose. When we're talking about mummies, or we're talking about people who are buried for some degree of time in the right kind of earth, under the right conditions, you're almost fossilizing them. Well, it takes a lot more time for someone who has been converted into leather or whatever to decompose as opposed to a fresh body whose own gut bacteria are devouring it. If that process is staved off, and the guts have been removed, you've gutted but we do this to animals, you dress them out in the field, you're not going to leave the guts in. You get rid of the guts, feed it to your dog or whatever. You don't keep that in the body. That's a reservoir of bacteria that will very quickly spoil the meat. So if you have mummified the person and probably wiped out most of their gut flora in the process, to the point where they're sitting there drying out long before the bacteria can devour the corpse, of course it's going to look incorruptible. There's no longer any food for the bacteria. It's dried up. The moisture content's too low now. The bacteria die off in droves. Decomposition stops unless weathering occurs. The same would be true of a saint. Buried in early winter, body gets frozen, flash frozen, under the right mineral conditions. Minerals seep into the body. They begin processing the material and rendering it impossible for at least the exterior of the body to be decomposed. It's a scientific process. It has nothing to do really with the occult. Really it has to do, it's a very interesting lore. It's very interesting mythology. It's very interesting superstition. It's a folklore, but it's not magic. It's a process that we can replicate in a lab. That's about all. Peace out.